Emotional, suspenseful, character-driven hook for the audience. What would you do if the world questioned your worth? Simply because of the seat you sat in on what was supposed to be an ordinary flight. Cameron Wells, a calm, accomplished black CEO, became the center of a storm when a flight attendant delivered more than just disrespect. He delivered a slap heard across the nation, but instead of fighting back with rage, Cameron chose stillness, composure, dignity, and in doing so, he didn't just change the outcome of that flight. He shook the conscience of an entire system. Why did the plane land just 10 minutes later? What happened after the cameras turned off? And how did one man's quiet resistance become a national reckoning? This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about legacy, power, and what happens when silence finally speaks. If you're ready to witness a journey that will make you think, feel, and reflect, then join us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that move your heart and awaken your voice. Let's begin. The hum of the car engine was barely audible beneath the low, ambient music that drifted from the stereo. Cameron Wells sat in the back seat of a sleek, black electric sedan, his fingers rhythmically tapping on the armrest. Outside the tinted window, the lights of Boston Logan's private terminal gleamed like distant fireflies, casting pale halos on the wet tarmac. He always felt something sacred in these quiet transitions before a flight. It wasn't about luxury or convenience. For Cameron, flying had always symbolized movement forward, upward, away from everything he had once been told he couldn't reach. Tonight's flight was supposed to be straightforward. No press, no ceremony, just a red-eye to Geneva to close the most significant deal of his life. Link, the company he had built from nights coding in his studio apartment, was poised to partner with an international coalition on climate data protection. It was the kind of contract that would shift global narratives and place Link among the giants. He glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. On time. The car came to a smooth stop outside the terminal. His assistant, Elena Chen, looked up from her phone in the front passenger seat and turned slightly toward him. "Jet's been cleared." "Hangar 4, she said softly, her voice efficient but warm. Cameron nodded and opened the door. A breeze met him cool and crisp, tinged with salt from the nearby harbor. The smell of jet fuel followed, like an old memory. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the day settle across his shoulders before rolling them back. As they approached the aircraft, Cameron caught sight of the jet's silhouette under the terminal lights. Sleek, silver, with a faint cobalt stripe cutting across the fuselage. He recognized the Ether Airlines logo near the tail. Privately chartered. Familiar. Routine. He hesitated for just a second at the base of the stairs. Nothing dramatic, just a faint, inexplicable pause. Something in his chest, not fear, but awareness. He dismissed it. Inside. The cabin was pristine. Wood-trimmed panels lined the walls, and cream-colored leather seats gleamed softly under ambient ceiling lights. Subtle jazz murmured through the speakers. Everything about the space whispered comfort, control. The flight attendant at the front greeted them with a professional nod. "Good evening, sir. Welcome aboard," the man said. His voice was neutral, but his eyes didn't quite match the tone. Cameron registered the expression quickly, something between forced politeness and reluctant acknowledgement. He gave a brief nod in return. "Evening." The attendant's name tag read Bradley Hinton. Cameron made a mental note of it, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. In business, as in life, it was often the smallest things, the slight shifts in body language, the pause between words that revealed everything. Elena took her seat across the aisle. She already had her laptop open, fingers gliding silently over the keyboard. He appreciated her focus, efficient, thoughtful, and always one step ahead. They had worked together for 6 years. She was the only person on his team who could read his silence like a conversation. Cameron settled into seat 2A. He adjusted the headrest slightly, stretched out his legs, and reached into his leather satchel for a worn, dog-eared notebook. He flipped it open, scanning his handwritten notes the names of international negotiators, keywords for climate legislation, timeline projections. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to his father, a mechanic, a man of few words, steady hands, and quiet pride. He used to take Cameron to the airfield on weekends, pointing up at the sky each time a jet soared overhead. "Don't let anyone tell you where you don't belong," he'd said once, wiping grease from his knuckles. "Especially not up there." Cameron smiled faintly at the memory. The plane began to taxi. Outside the window, Boston's skyline shimmered like a sleeping giant. As the wheels left the ground, Cameron closed his eyes. Flying had always calmed him, but tonight, something was different. He couldn't quite name it. A subtle weight pressed at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just nerves. It was something deeper, an intuition he had learned to trust. There was no obvious reason for concern. He'd taken dozens of flights like this. The jet was quiet, the cabin crew minimal. No paparazzi, no executives to manage, no turbulence on radar. But still, he opened his eyes slowly and looked across the aisle at Elena. She was watching him, concern flickering just beneath her calm. "You good?" she mouthed. He nodded once, a small gesture. They both knew what that meant. For now, everything appeared fine, but appearances rarely told the full story. As the aircraft climbed, Cameron reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone. A new message from his son, Mason, lit up the screen. "Can't wait to build a new drone with you when you get back. Love you, Dad." Cameron stared at the words for a long time. He responded simply, "I'll be back soon. Love you too." He set the phone down beside him and exhaled. Above the clouds now, the world below vanished in darkness. All that remained was the hum of engines, the soft rustle of air, and a lingering feeling that the smooth surface of this journey was hiding something underneath. He didn't know yet what it was, but something inside him whispered. He would find out soon. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm amber glow as the aircraft leveled out above the Atlantic. Ether Airlines had always prided itself on luxury and discretion. Every detail of their private charter division was curated to impress custom wood grain accents, cushioned leather seats that reclined at a whisper, and a signature scent that hinted of eucalyptus and lavender. To most passengers, this was elegance. To Cameron Wells, it was simply another environment he had learned to navigate with precision. Just like every boardroom summit or high-level roundtable, he knew the unspoken rules. He knew where the stairs lingered too long. He knew how tone disguised judgment. And above all, he knew how politeness could become a blade. Across from him, Elena Chen adjusted her reading glasses, eyes flitting between her tablet and a thin printout of tomorrow's briefing notes. Occasionally, she glanced at Cameron. He hadn't said much since takeoff, but that wasn't unusual. Cameron often retreated into quiet thought during flights, reviewing numbers in his head or replaying conversations he planned to have. But this time felt different. He wasn't distracted by spreadsheets or timelines. His focus was subtle, sharpened, watchful. The kind of focus a man develops not from paranoia, but from experience. Bradley Hinton re-entered the cabin. His walk was crisp and purposeful, the kind trained over years in premium service. He moved down the aisle, scanning seat belts, straightening napkins, smiling at passengers with just enough warmth to seem welcoming, but not so much that it invited conversation. He didn't look at Cameron, not once. That, in itself, was the first real sign. Earlier, Bradley had acknowledged him barely with a nod that bordered on dismissal. Now, Cameron felt the familiar twinge of exclusion that didn't come from loud words or outright rejection, but from omission, a subtle kind of erasure. Bradley paused briefly at Elena's row. "Ms. Chen, would you like to select your meal?" he asked smoothly, holding out a digital tablet. She blinked. "Oh, of course. Thank you," she said, her voice carefully neutral. He waited while she selected her entree herb chicken with couscous and grilled vegetables, and then turned away, without a word. Still, not a glance toward Cameron. He watched the man walk away, his jaw quietly tightening. It was nothing, and it was everything. When Elena glanced up again, Cameron gave a barely perceptible shake of the head. Let it go for now. A few minutes passed. A different attendant brought warm towels, folded neatly on tiny ceramic trays. Cameron took his with a nod of thanks, gently unfolding it between his fingers. The scent of lemongrass drifted up from the cloth. Familiar, controlled, safe. Except it wasn't. He tried to shake the growing tension. Maybe Bradley had a long day. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it didn't mean what he feared it meant. But Cameron knew better. A lifetime had taught him how disrespect wore masks. He looked out the window. Below, the darkness of the ocean stretched endlessly, indifferent to the politics of the cabin. The clouds reflected back the light from the jet's wings. Inside, quiet laughter drifted from a row behind him. Two investors from Oslo sharing stories in low voices. He tried to lean into the calm. He had a meeting tomorrow that could change international policy. That was the focus. That was the mission. This flight, these people, this moment, it was noise. He just needed to land, lead, and leave the rest behind. But his breath caught slightly when Bradley returned. "Dinner service beginning," the attendant said, not addressing anyone in particular. Carts rolled out. The scent of roasted meat and truffle oil filled the cabin. Elena received her dish just as she ordered. Others were served in sequence, with smiles and quiet affirmations. Cameron waited. No tray came. He waited longer. Elena looked over. "Do you want me to know?" he said quietly. "Let's see how this plays out." Finally, after most passengers had been served, Bradley appeared beside him, tray in hand, without eye contact. He lowered it onto Cameron's table. There was no grilled salmon, no jasmine rice. What sat on the plate looked like overcooked pasta and a pile of underseasoned spinach. Lukewarm, sloppily arranged. Cameron glanced at the food, then up at Bradley. "I had requested the salmon. With rice." Bradley didn't flinch. "This is what we have," he replied curtly. "We had limited supplies." Cameron paused. He didn't raise his voice. "I understand, but I pre-ordered my meal 2 weeks ago. It was confirmed by your concierge." Bradley's smile sharpened at the edges, his voice dropping just enough to slice. "You're lucky to get anything at all." Then he walked off without waiting for a reply. Silence bloomed in Cameron's chest like heat. He sat back, unmoving. Elena's eyes locked on his. concern flickering just beneath the surface. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. The slight had been clear, public, intentional. And while the pasta on his tray could be ignored, the implication could not. His mind shifted from meal to meaning. He knew this type of man, the kind who believed service came with superiority, the kind who saw a black man in a tailored suit and needed to remind him, subtly or sharply, of a perceived place. Cameron folded his hands in his lap. He had faced moments like this before, moments that begged for a reaction, that tested not just patience, but dignity. But this time, there was something else, something sharper under Bradley's breath, a kind of contempt that went beyond inconvenience or miscommunication. It was resentment that made it dangerous. He took a slow breath. The food sat untouched on the table before him. Behind him, 2 passengers whispered, their tone hushed, uncertain. He didn't look back. Instead, he stared straight ahead, letting the sting of the insult settle, not as anger, but as clarity. He would not allow himself to be reduced by this man, but he would not let it pass either. Not this time. The rules had shifted. He just didn't know yet how far the turbulence would go. The sound of cutlery clinking lightly against porcelain drifted through the cabin. It should have been a peaceful moment. A quiet evening flight. Full bellies. Dimmed lights. But in Cameron Wells' corner of the aircraft, the air had gone still and heavy. The tray of food in front of him remained untouched. The pasta had begun to dry at the edges. The spinach wilted. A smear of cheese clung to the side of the plate, like an afterthought. It was not what he'd ordered. More than that, it was not what he deserved. But it wasn't about food anymore. Cameron sat perfectly upright in his seat, his breathing controlled, hands calmly folded in his lap. Elena glanced over again. He could see the question in her eyes, the silent nudge. "Do you want me to step in?" He shook his head gently. Not yet. His fingers tapped once against his knee. A measured gesture. He had dealt with worse. This was not new terrain. The difference was that now, he no longer had the luxury of ignoring it. This was the kind of moment that revealed character. Not just his own, but everyone's. Would people speak up? Would someone say something? Or would the hush of privilege and politeness settle over the moment like fog? The cabin crew moved on. No one returned to check on him. No one asked if his meal was satisfactory. He might as well have been invisible. He let the silence stretch. Another 10 minutes passed. Then he pressed the small silver service button overhead. The chime was soft, polite, almost dainty, a mechanical sound designed to keep peace at altitude. No one came. The cart remained parked mid-aisle. A different attendant, a young man with sandy blonde hair, stood beside it checking inventory. He didn't look up. Didn't move. Cameron exhaled slowly and tried again. Still nothing. Helena was watching closely now. Bradley reappeared 20 minutes later. He walked with a rigid posture, tray in hand, delivering drinks to a row of German executives in the rear. His movements were tight, measured, efficient. But when he passed Cameron's seat, he paused. Just long enough to make it clear he had seen the call button. He didn't stop. Cameron's jaw tightened ever so slightly. A muscle flickered near his temple, barely noticeable. But to Elena, who had learned to read his silences, it was a thunderclap. He waited a beat, then stood. The motion was calm, quiet, but in the still air of the cabin, it made more noise than a shout. He walked up the aisle with deliberate steps and stopped near the galley where Bradley stood, back turned, reviewing a list on a small screen. "Excuse me," Cameron said, his voice even. Bradley turned slowly, expression unreadable. "Yes, there seems to be a misunderstanding," Cameron said, careful with each word. "I requested a specific meal 2 weeks ago. It was confirmed. Instead, I received something else, and no one's followed up. I pressed the service button twice. No response." Bradley tilted his head slightly. "We're short on options tonight. Like I said earlier, you're lucky to get anything at all." His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't professional either. It had an edge to it, a quiet sharpness, veiled in formality but loud enough to be unmistakable. Cameron didn't blink. "This isn't about the food," he said. Bradley's mouth twitched into something close to a smile, but not a kind one. "Of course it's not." There it was, the implication behind the words. The boundary had been crossed, but quietly. Nothing loud enough to provoke immediate outrage, just enough to cause damage. Cameron kept his posture steady. "I'd like to speak with the captain," he said, voice calm. That seemed to flick a switch. Bradley's face tightened. "You're kidding." "Right," he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Over a meal. Over how this was handled," Cameron replied, professionally, calmly, and now with escalating concern. "You've got some nerve," Bradley muttered. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Cameron stepped back slightly, sensing the shift. Bradley's shoulders squared, his eyes narrowing, his entire body bristling like a wire pulled too tight. The air between them crackled, not with confrontation, but with something more dangerous resentment. "You walk on like you own the place," Bradley said, leaning in slightly. "Demanding, entitled." Cameron didn't move. "I expect basic respect," he said. The silence that followed was so sharp it could have sliced glass. Then it happened, without warning, without build-up. Bradley's hand rose and came down in one motion. An open-handed slap cracked across Cameron's face. The sound tore through the cabin like a gunshot. Sudden, loud, unbelievable. Time stalled. Cameron did not fall. He didn't even stumble. But the force of it rang in his ears. A flash of white-hot pressure against his cheek. A rush of heat. And then stillness. Around them, passengers froze. Someone gasped. A glass clinked to the floor. A man across the aisle straightened in his seat, stunned. A woman 2 rows ahead turned slowly, mouth open. Even Elena rose halfway from her seat before catching herself. Cameron stood perfectly still. His left cheek stung, but it was the weight of the moment that struck harder. Bradley had already turned and was storming toward the back of the plane. His footsteps clipped and fast. Not a word, not a glance back. The silence that followed felt alive. Thick, dense, charged. The entire cabin watched. No one spoke. No one intervened. Cameron reached up and touched his face lightly, fingertips grazing the warmth left behind. He let his hand fall, then turned slowly and walked back to his seat. Every step deliberate, every eye on him. He sat down, folded his hands, and breathed, not out of fear, but to remain still. Elena leaned in, voice low. "Are you okay?" He nodded once, but the answer was more complicated than yes or no. He wasn't physically hurt. That wasn't the issue. He had been assaulted, not just as a man, not just as a CEO, but as a symbol of something that someone like Bradley couldn't stand to see sitting in seat 2A with authority, dignity, and calm. And in that moment, something inside Cameron shifted. He didn't want revenge. He wanted resolution. And that meant doing something most people never expect when they cross a man like him. He would stand still. Then he would move the world. Time didn't move, not in the way clocks usually tick or seconds usually pass. For Cameron Wells, the moment after the slap stretched into a strange, weightless space where everything was sharp and slow. The humming of the engine seemed to grow louder, like a background track turned up too high. His heart wasn't racing. It was steady, focused, but the rest of the cabin, the passengers, the crew, even the air had frozen. He sat in his seat again, upright, composed, the sting on his cheek fading beneath the weight of something far more powerful. Awareness. People had seen. That was important. The man in the beige linen suit, 2 rows up, had flinched. The woman in the navy dress across the aisle had covered her mouth. Elena had stood, then sat, then leaned forward with the tight concern of someone both furious and afraid of what might happen next. But no one spoke. No one moved. No one addressed the absurdity of what had just happened. Cameron looked out the window, not seeing clouds, not seeing ocean, just a reflection of himself staring back. His face was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that came from years of learning how to survive while composed. A calm that had been practiced, honed, and sharpened through countless rooms where he had been the only one who looked like him. He had expected hostility in boardrooms, but not here. Not 35,000 feet in the air. Not from someone whose job it was to serve with dignity. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. He had always believed that power didn't come from how loudly you reacted, but from how precisely you responded. That belief had carried him through moments of covert disrespect. Moments when he'd been spoken over in meetings or mistaken for someone else's assistant. Those moments he had endured, reclaimed, reframed. But this crossed into another territory. This was violence, not metaphorical, not subtle, actual physical aggression, open-handed, public, and unjustified. And still, no apology, no explanation, no intervention, only silence. Elena leaned in again, whispering, "Cam, you need to report this. Right now." "I will," he said softly, "but I need to do it right." She understood immediately. Not loud, not rash, but unshakable. He reached up and pressed the call button once more. The light flicked on above his seat. A soft chime echoed. This time, someone responded. It wasn't Bradley. It was the younger male flight attendant who had avoided his gaze earlier. He approached slowly, cautiously, a clipboard still clutched in his hand. "Sir," he said quietly, eyes flicking between Cameron's face and the call light. Cameron's voice was measured. "I'd like to speak to the captain, immediately." The attendant hesitated. "Sir, may I ask?" "There's been an incident," Cameron interrupted gently, but firmly. "I was physically assaulted by a member of your crew. I won't be filing a complaint after landing. I won't be speaking to a PR rep. I need to speak to the captain. Now." The attendant froze, then nodded quickly. I'll let him know." He disappeared behind the curtain, steps brisk. The call light dimmed. Around Cameron, there was movement now. Quiet shifts in posture, glances. The couple seated diagonally behind him were murmuring. A man near the galley had begun typing on his phone under his tray table, trying to be discreet. Elena stayed seated, but alert, eyes never leaving the aisle. 10 minutes passed. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Algren stepped out. Mid-50s, tall, gray at the temples, uniform pristine. His eyes scanned the cabin with that practiced pilot's composure, the kind of look that could assess an engine fire or a screaming baby with equal professionalism. He walked toward Cameron and crouched beside his seat. "Mr. Wells," he said quietly, "my attendant said you've made a serious report." Cameron turned to him fully. "Yes, Captain. I was physically struck across the face by your flight attendant, Bradley Hinton. There was no provocation, no raised voice, no aggression on my part, just a calm request regarding a mishandled meal. What I received in return was a slap." The captain's jaw tensed, but he remained steady. "I understand. I'm going to have to speak with the crew member. But please know I've already spoken." Cameron said, "What I need now is action." The words were not loud, but they hit with weight. Captain Algren nodded slowly. "I take this seriously." "You should," Cameron said, "because so will the press, and so will the law, and so will every person who sees the footage that was just recorded on at least one phone in this cabin." The captain glanced over his shoulder, noting for the first time that several passengers were watching with eyes wide and devices in hand. He turned back. "What do you want us to do?" "Land this plane," Cameron said calmly. "Emergency protocol. Handle it while it's still within your hands, or let it spiral out of control later." The pilot stood, straightened his jacket. "I'll confer with security." He walked back toward the cockpit. Elena turned her head slightly. "You just changed everything." "No," Cameron murmured. "I just forced them to look." Outside the cabin windows, the stars still gleamed against the midnight blue. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted. From uneasy silence to undeniable reckoning. Passengers didn't whisper anymore. They watched. The chime sounded again. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen onboard incident, we will be making an emergency landing at Reykjavik International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." A ripple of energy surged through the cabin. Not panic, not chaos, but awareness, the kind that spreads when something has gone wrong and no one can pretend otherwise anymore. Cameron closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of the aircraft shift subtly as it began its descent. He felt the pressure change in his ears, the faint whine of the engines adjusting. He opened his eyes again. This was no longer about him. It hadn't been since the moment Bradley raised his hand. This was about what that moment represented, what it meant for every other man who might sit in seat 2A one day, and what it said about a system that could allow silence to answer injustice. That silence was ending now, whether they were ready or not. The silence had teeth. Cameron Wells sat motionless in his seat as the aircraft descended, the subtle tilt of the nose dipping toward the black horizon, the seatbelt buckle pressed against his waist. The tray in front of him still held the untouched meal, a quiet testament to the moment that had shifted everything. No one spoke. Passengers glanced, then quickly turned away. Some pretended to read. Others just stared at nothing, faces flushed with discomfort. The slap had landed only minutes ago, but its echo still trembled in the cabin like a string stretched too tight. Elena Chen didn't move either. She sat across the aisle. Her gaze locked on Cameron. Her eyes said everything. Fury, grief, respect, fear. But she didn't say a word. She knew him well enough to understand that stillness was not weakness. It was intention. The engines lowered their pitch. The fastened seatbelt sign chimed again. Not that anyone dared to unbuckle. At the far end of the cabin, Bradley Hinton had vanished behind the curtain. Not another word from him. Not even a glimpse. He'd struck a man 30,000 feet in the air and walked away as if nothing had happened. No apology, no explanation, just retreat. And still, no one in uniform had returned to check on Cameron. That fact lingered in the air like smoke. The minutes passed slowly. Then finally, the cockpit door opened again. This time, Captain Algren didn't speak over the intercom. He walked quietly down the aisle and crouched next to Cameron's seat once more. "I've notified Reykjavik," he said, voice low. "We're being prioritized for landing. There will be emergency personnel waiting on the ground." Cameron turned his head slightly. "Are you removing Bradley from duty?" "Yes," the captain replied. "Effective immediately. He'll be escorted off the aircraft and detained by airport security." Cameron nodded. Algren hesitated before continuing. "I want to personally apologize for what happened to you. It was inexcusable." Cameron studied the man's face. There was no smugness there, no attempt at PR polish, just weariness, recognition, maybe even shame. "Apologies are only useful when followed by action," Cameron said calmly. "And this isn't just about a single man who lost control. It's about what allowed him to believe he could." Algren straightened. "I understand." "Good," Cameron said. "Then let's make sure you remember this moment when the press calls." The captain didn't respond, but the message was clear. He returned to the cockpit. A moment later, the voice of the co-pilot came on the intercom, calm and professional. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The cabin lights dimmed. Outside the window, the darkness gave way to patches of glowing city light. Reykjavik's grid shimmered beneath low clouds, amber and gold against the deep blue. Cameron exhaled, one long breath, then another. The moment was nearing its end, or maybe its beginning. The wheels touched down with a low screech. The jet slowed rapidly, breaking into the dim wash of runway lights. No one clapped. No one spoke. There was no relief in the landing, only tension that had found a new place to settle. As the plane rolled toward a private gate, Cameron's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket. 3 messages in rapid succession. The first was from Mason. "Are you in Switzerland yet?" Cameron stared at the screen for a long moment. His son's message pierced the fog of adrenaline. For a moment, the edges of the world softened. He replied with only 2 words, "Not yet." The second message was from Elena's assistant. Media inquiry from Boston Globe. Saw video. Wanting confirmation. The third was a notification. Video uploaded. Black CEO slapped mid-flight by flight attendant. Plane makes emergency landing. It was already online. Cameron turned the phone face down and looked ahead. At the front of the cabin, the door opened. 2 airport security officers boarded. One wore a navy blue vest with Reykjavik insignia. The other held a tablet and scanned the passenger manifest. There was no drama, no raised voices, just quiet steps and calm authority. They walked to the back of the plane. Bradley emerged slowly from behind the curtain. His expression was unreadable. Not embarrassed, not angry, just blank. He didn't resist, didn't argue. The passengers watched silently as he was led down the aisle and off the aircraft. A few people turned their faces, unable to maintain eye contact. Others stared straight ahead, expressions carved from politeness and guilt. As Bradley disappeared through the doorway, something in the cabin seemed to exhale. The pressure released, just slightly. The moment had passed, but the weight of it had not. Cameron remained seated, still, composed. Elna leaned toward him. "It's out there," she whispered. People are already talking. I know, he said. You want me to handle media? Not yet. She nodded. Cameron reached down, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood. The cabin turned toward him as if pulled by gravity. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his hands. He simply walked forward, stepping past passengers who had watched him get hit and done nothing. Not one word of apology came from them either, but he didn't need their words. He had the truth now, the real kind, the undeniable kind. He stepped through the open doorway and into the cool Icelandic night. The air hit his skin like ice water, fresh, sharp, awake. A security officer guided him toward a waiting lounge inside the terminal. Elena followed silently. Inside, a polished woman in a navy suit greeted them, offering tea, seating, apologies. Cameron said little. He didn't need to explain what had happened. By now, the world was watching. He sat down in a quiet corner of the lounge, the glass walls revealing the dark runway behind him. Elena scrolled through her phone. Every major outlet is picking it up, she said softly. The footage shows your face, the moment after, your restraint. He nodded. The image would go viral. Not the violence, but the aftermath. A black man, composed, dignified, sitting still with a red mark on his face and fire in his eyes. He didn't need to shout. He just needed to wait, because something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the system that had allowed this to happen. And he was going to make sure that shift kept moving, all the way to the ground. The lounge was too quiet. Outside the glass, the jet sat motionless under a curtain of mist, its sleek body outlined by floodlights. Inside, the soft hum of distant announcements echoed across the empty Reykjavik terminal. Cameron Wells sat in a dark leather chair, his spine straight, one hand resting on the armrest while the other gently tapped his phone screen. He wasn't scrolling. He wasn't texting. He was thinking, calculating, across from him. Elena Chen held a paper cup of tea between her palms, but she hadn't taken a sip. Her eyes remained on Cameron, quietly reading the lines of tension around his eyes, the way he blinked less than usual, the way his breath came in slow, steady rhythms that didn't belong to a man who was fine. He wasn't fine. He was focused. The door to the lounge creaked open. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped inside, flanked by two airport security officers. His salt and pepper hair and creased brow made him look like someone used to authority, but right now he carried himself with hesitation. "Mr. Wells," the man said. "I'm Harold Evers, Director of International Operations for Ether Airlines. I came as soon as I was informed." Cameron nodded once, expression unreadable. Harold cleared his throat and sat across from him. "First and foremost, I want to apologize. What happened on board tonight is unacceptable. We're deeply disturbed. We've already begun a formal investigation, and the flight attendant in question has been relieved of all duties pending review." Cameron didn't answer right away. He let the words hang in the air, just long enough to force Harold to sit in the discomfort. Finally, he spoke. "An investigation implies uncertainty. What part of the incident are you unclear about?" Harold shifted in his seat. "Well, we of course want to follow standard procedures and hear from all parties involved." Cameron cut in, calm but unwavering. "Bradley Hinton struck me in front of passengers. I asked for assistance. I was ignored. I requested a conversation with the captain. He complied, and I asked for an emergency landing. Everything that happened was witnessed. Some of it recorded. This isn't unclear. It's uncomfortable, but not unclear." The man swallowed hard. "Mr. Wells, I understand your position, And I want you to know I don't want a personal apology, Cameron said, voice still even. I don't want a settlement, and I don't want silence dressed up as sympathy. What I want is accountability. Harold opened his mouth, but Cameron didn't let him speak. I want a formal statement from Ether Airlines acknowledging the incident. Not internally, publicly. I want a review of your onboard staff training. I want a copy of every passenger complaint made about Mr. Hinton in the last 5 years, and I want the name of his direct supervisor. The room felt smaller now. Elena didn't look away. Harold straightened his tie, struggling to maintain the corporate mask. That's a lot to process, he said carefully. Cameron leaned forward, his voice dropping just slightly in tone. I haven't even started. Harold blinked. I'm not doing this for retribution, Cameron continued. I'm doing this because what happened to me tonight is not isolated. You know it. I know it. Everyone in that cabin knew something was off from the start, but they stayed quiet. He paused. I've spent my life walking into rooms where I was expected to shrink. I refused. I built Aeon Link from a 1-bedroom apartment with nothing but student debt and a second-hand laptop. I've raised a son in a world that still tries to convince him he's too much or not enough. And I'm not about to let a man like Bradley Hinton remind me of a lie I stopped believing in long ago. Harold's hands curled slightly in his lap. Cameron finished his thought. You want to show me you're sorry? Start acting like this matters. There was a knock at the door. A young woman in a midnight blue uniform entered. She handed Harold a tablet with trembling hands and whispered something in his ear. He nodded, stood slowly, and turned back toward Cameron. The media knows, he said quietly. We're receiving requests from CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. It's spreading quickly. Cameron didn't flinch. I'm aware. Elena glanced at her phone. Trending across 5 countries, she confirmed. Harold took a breath. Is there anything we can do to make this go away? Cameron's smile was thin, cold, almost pitying. That question, he said, is the reason it won't. Harold didn't have a response. Cameron stood and straightened his jacket. I'm taking a few hours here in Reykjavik. I'll continue on to Geneva tomorrow on another airline. As of this moment, Aeon Link is suspending all travel partnerships with Ether Airlines. My assistant will issue the formal statement within the hour. Harold's face fell, but Cameron wasn't finished. And if I see a single word in your company's press release that attempts to minimize, deflect, or distort what happened, be prepared for legal action and a shareholder review. There was silence. Finally, Harold nodded and stepped aside. Elena stood and joined Cameron. Together, they exited the lounge and stepped into the cool hallway, their footsteps echoing in unison. In the terminal, the lights felt brighter than they had on the plane. Clean, honest, no shadows. Cameron exhaled slowly. Let's write, he said. They found a quiet corner near Gate 14. Elena opened her laptop and began typing as Cameron dictated. We do not believe in silence when harm is done. We do not believe in comfort over truth. We believe that accountability is not optional. Aeon Link stands firmly in opposition to any environment that permits disrespect, discrimination, or abuse of authority in any form. He paused, then added, Our dignity is not negotiable. When the final period was placed, Elena looked up. Should I send it? Yes, Cameron said. Do you want to wait for legal? No. Do you want to proofread? I already did. She hit send. In that instant, something changed. Not just in a news cycle or corporate inbox, but in the very current of how power moved. It didn't shout. It didn't swing back. It stood still, and then it demanded better. Cameron Wells barely slept. Even after moving to a quiet hotel suite overlooking the Reykjavik harbor, even after closing the blinds and sipping the herbal tea left by the front desk, his mind refused rest. The slap hadn't haunted him. It was the silence. After that did. The silence of the passengers. The silence of the airline executives. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around injustice and called it procedure. The sun never fully set in the Icelandic summer. By 4:00 m, the sky was a soft gray canvas. Cameron stood at the window, arms crossed, watching a cargo ship move across the horizon like a slow thought. His phone lit up again. He turned it over. Another flood of notifications. This time, it wasn't just journalists. It was strangers. A woman named Andrea, whose profile photo showed her in a wheelchair, had written, "I watched your video, and I cried. I've never seen someone stay so calm while the world failed them. You made me feel brave." A man from Atlanta had written, "My father was a pilot. He always told me some people don't want to see a black man in a seat of power. You made them see anyway." Cameron stared at the messages without replying. They were kind, moving, but they weren't what he needed right now. He needed clarity. He needed strategy. The truth was, he hadn't decided what came next. His instincts told him to stay measured, to protect his privacy, to let the company's statement stand and move on with the Geneva summit. But something in him itched against that. Something deeper. Because if the world was going to see him, if the slap was going to define the moment, then it couldn't just end in a corporate memo. There had to be more. There had to be meaning. By mid-morning, Elena had set up a video call in the suite's conference area. She appeared on screen from Boston, now back at Aon Link's global headquarters. "Cam," she said gently, "CNN wants you live tonight. Prime time. They'll fly in a crew." Cameron remained quiet. "GMA too, Anderson Cooper, even BBC, they all want a moment with you?" He rubbed his chin slowly, voice low. "They want the face, the wound, not the story?" "Maybe," Helena said. "But what if we give them both?" He looked up. "I'm not a symbol." "You're not," she said. "But right now, you represent something that people are finally ready to look at." He nodded once. "How are the investors responding?" "No drop," Helena replied. "Actually, shares are up. People are calling you steady, controlled, presidential." He gave a small, ironic smile. "I didn't get slapped for a marketing boost." "I know," she said softly. "But Cam, this is a moment. You can either endure it or use it." He leaned back in his chair. His father's words echoed again, quietly in his mind. "Don't let anyone tell you where you don't belong." That had always been the thread through his life, from the underfunded schools to the boardrooms that looked at him as a checkbox. He had never shouted. He had never thrown a chair or slammed a door, but he had made waves, because presence was its own form of protest. "I'll do one interview," he said, "not for drama, for clarity." Elena smiled softly. "CNN. Make it PBS," he said. "I want the audience to hear, not just react." "Got it. And then," Cameron added, "set up a town hall." She paused. "A town hall?" "Yes," he said. "Online, public. I want people to speak. Not just about this. About every time a uniform became a weapon. About every moment someone swallowed pain to keep peace." She nodded slowly. "I'll build it out. Give it a name," he said. "Something honest. Something simple." Elena thought for a moment. "Altitude," she said. "Because you were up there when it happened. Because we all rise when we confront this. Cameron's chest rose and fell with a slow breath. Perfect. That afternoon, the world responded. Ether Airlines issued a second, far more carefully worded statement. It included phrases like deep regret and commitment to review, but it still avoided one word: racism. Cameron noticed. And so did the public. Commentators on late-night shows dissected every frame of the viral footage. Body language experts explained the power of stillness. Social media flooded with threads titled things like "Why Cameron Wells Matters" and "The Quiet Revolution in Seat 2A." Some dismissed it. They said he had overreacted, that it was just a bad flight, a bad apple. But more voices pushed back. They said it was about a culture that allowed some people to act without consequence, and others to be questioned for existing. A woman from Detroit uploaded a tearful video. My son watched that clip. She said, "He looked at Mr. Wells and said, he didn't hit back. Mama, he just sat like a king." That night, Cameron sat down in front of a softly lit camera in Reykjavik. No stage, no applause, just a chair, a quiet room, and a man who had decided to stop shrinking. He looked directly into the lens. "I wasn't supposed to make headlines this week," he began. "I was supposed to make policy. Climate policy. Global infrastructure. That's why I boarded the plane." He paused. But the story changed. Because of one man's actions, because of one moment that millions of people saw, a moment where someone's uniform gave them permission to cross a line, and a moment where I had to decide how to respond. His voice never rose. I didn't hit back. I didn't shout, but I didn't stay silent either. He let the pause settle. Because silence is the soil where this behavior grows, where power becomes abuse, where dignity is treated like defiance. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for reckoning." And the interview continued, measured, gracious, but unflinching. The next morning, headlines around the world read "Cameron Wells Speaks. Grace Under Fire. A flight, a slap, a stand seat, 2A became a mirror." The man who had once been dismissed as lucky to get anything at all had become something else entirely. A symbol, a standard, a spark, and the world was still watching. The morning after the PBS interview, Cameron Wells awoke to a sunrise, the color of fire and frost. Reykjavik's skyline looked like a painting, jagged rooftops and snow-capped ridges outlined in gold. But Cameron wasn't thinking about the view. He was thinking about the messages. They were endless now. His inbox overflowed. Some were from world leaders and senators. Others were from baristas, teachers, high school students, single mothers. They didn't all say the same thing, but one emotion ran through all of them: recognition. People saw themselves in that moment on the plane, the moment when he didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't crumble, just sat still with the weight of injustice pressed against his skin. It had become more than an incident. It had become a mirror. Elena Chen called shortly after 7. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight with emotion. She sent him a video. Cameron opened it, expecting another pundit commentary. Instead, it was a recorded statement. A woman in an Ether Airlines uniform, standing in what looked like a break room. Her name badge read Talia Monroe. She looked into the camera, nerves in her expression, but determination in her posture. "I've worked for Ether Airlines for 7 years. She began. "I wasn't on that flight, but I know Bradley Hinton, and I know how he talks about certain passengers when no one's listening." Cameron sat forward. Talia continued. "He has a way of talking when he thinks the room agrees with him. He's made jokes. He's mocked passengers. He once said that people like the man in 2A needed to be reminded who the real authority was. He never used the word, but everyone knew what he meant. Her voice shook now. We were told to ignore it, that it wasn't our place. But watching that video, seeing Mr. Wells sit there, composed after what Bradley did, I realized silence was complicity. She looked down, then back up. So I'm speaking now. I'm done being quiet, and I hope others are too. The video ended. Cameron stared at the frozen frame, her face strong, open, raw. Another message pinged. This one from a crew member who had been on his flight. A simple note. I didn't stop him. I should have. I'm sorry. The shift had started. Not from corporations, but from the ground. People who had seen too much for too long. He forwarded the video to Elena. We protect her, he said. If she gets fired, we go public. Already on it. Elena replied, We're setting up a support fund and legal aid hotline. She's not alone. Another message came through, this time from an unexpected name, Captain Algren. Cameron hesitated, then opened the message. Mr. Wells, I owe you more than an apology. I've submitted a full report to the FAA and have requested Bradley's certification be reviewed. What happened wasn't just wrong. It was a breach of duty. I'm willing to testify if needed. You deserve better. Cameron sat back in his chair, eyes closed for a moment. He had expected corporate spin, carefully chosen words, defensiveness. But not this. Not accountability. He typed a reply. Thank you for your integrity, Captain. That matters more than you know. Later that afternoon, he walked along the Reykjavik waterfront alone. The wind bit at his coat collar. Gulls circled above the harbor. The ground beneath him was uneven stone, but steady. He wasn't wearing sunglasses. He wasn't hiding. A woman passed by with her daughter. The little girl tugged on her sleeve and pointed. Is that the man from the video? She asked. Her mother hesitated, then nodded. They didn't approach. They just smiled. The little girl waved. Cameron waved back. Something shifted in his chest. Not pride, not ego, belonging. When he returned to the hotel, Elna was waiting in the lounge. We just got a call, she said, breathless. From the White House. He raised an eyebrow. They want you to join a working group on equity and federal transportation policy. They want your input. Publicly. Cameron's lips parted slightly in surprise. They've been watching too. Yes, she said. And they're listening. He walked to the window. The ocean stretched wide beyond the snow-dusted rooftops. Then we don't waste the moment. They spent the next few hours outlining the upcoming town hall. Invitations to civil rights leaders, testimonials from flight crew, data on bias in air travel. They wanted to move beyond his story. They wanted to build something from it. As they worked, a message came in from his son. Saw you on TV. Dad, proud of you. You looked like Grandpa when he gave that speech at church. Strong. Cameron stared at the screen for a long time. He remembered that speech. He had been 13, sitting in the second pew, watching his father speak to a crowd of tired men and hopeful women about rising above injustice. He had told them, they can shake you, but they cannot take you. That memory now rose like breath in Cameron's lungs. Later that night, he sat alone on the balcony. A new video had just surfaced. A passenger who had filmed from several rows behind him. It showed everything. The tone, the disregard, the slap, the silence. But what struck Cameron most was what happened after. The camera lingered on him in the moments no one had really noticed. After Bradley walked away, after the pain settled, it showed his face. Not angry, not broken, but still. It showed him reaching for the window, staring out into the dark. And it showed something else, too. A man rising slowly, choosing not to vanish, choosing not to let the story end in a cabin full of whispers. The video's caption read, "When silence didn't protect him, stillness did." He watched it 3 times, then closed the screen. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work, the policy, the hearings, the uncomfortable conversations, the change. But tonight, in this quiet country with the endless skies, he allowed himself one thing. Not victory, not vengeance, just rest, and the knowledge that truth, when spoken gently but firmly, echoes far beyond the seat where it begins. The hall was filled before the doors opened. Word had spread quickly. The event wasn't televised. It wasn't flashy. There were no PR banners or corporate logos. Just a modest room with folding chairs, soft lighting, and a microphone placed in the center aisle. It had no stage. That was intentional. Cameron Wells didn't want elevation. He wanted connection. Elena stood by the check-in table, greeting guests with quiet warmth. Some arrived holding printed tickets. Others simply walked in from the street. A few wore suits. Most didn't. There were teachers, delivery drivers, flight crew in partial uniform, teenagers holding hands, elders walking slowly with canes. No one asked for autographs. No one took selfies. They came to speak, and more importantly, to be heard. Cameron sat in the front row, wearing a charcoal sweater. No blazer, no fanfare. He held a notebook and pen, not as props, but as tools. Tonight was not about making statements. It was about listening to them. At exactly 7 p.m. Elena stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady. "This gathering is about shared truth. Tonight we're not here to debate whether injustice exists. We're here because it does, and because we're tired of pretending it doesn't. This is altitude, a space to rise, not in anger, but in awareness." She looked at Cameron, then back at the room. "The floor is yours." The first voice came from the middle row. A man in his late 50s stood and approached the microphone. He wore a faded security guard uniform and spoke with a voice cracked by time. "My name's Reggie. Been working at the airport 26 years. I've seen a lot, mostly good folks, but I've also seen things I can't unsee. I once watched a young man get dragged out of the first-class lounge because someone assumed he didn't belong there. No warning, just grabbed, like he was furniture out of place." He paused. "I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that if I spoke, I'd lose my job, and I needed the job." His eyes glistened. "But I see now, silence has a cost, and it ain't just paid by the one being hurt." Cameron nodded quietly. The next speaker was a woman in a burgundy coat. She was tall, with a calm presence and the posture of someone who had carried a lot without complaint. "My daughter flies ether every month. She's a pilot. Proud of her. Black woman in the cockpit. But she told me one day someone mistook her for a cleaner, handed her a trash bag before she even got to her post." The room exhaled as one. She didn't say anything. She just smiled, because she thought if she pushed back, they'd call her difficult. A few people nodded. "She's strong, but even strong people get tired." Then came a teenager, maybe 16, skinny jeans, oversized hoodie, chipped nail polish. She took the mic with shaking hands. I know I'm not corporate, she said quickly. I'm not rich. I'm not important. But I saw that video, and I saw the way Mr. Wells didn't scream. I saw how he stayed still. She took a breath. I've been there. Not on a plane, but in classrooms, grocery stores, people assuming, people laughing under their breath. I didn't know what to do. But seeing him, I thought, maybe I'm not wrong to be quiet. Maybe quiet doesn't mean weak. Cameron looked at her gently. Quiet can be powerful, he said softly. The room stayed silent for a moment longer. Then, a hand rose from the back. A man stepped forward wearing an Ether Airlines service vest. His name tag read Jorge. His eyes were steady. I was on that flight, he said. Murmurs swept the room. I'm the one who stood near the galley when it happened. I heard the slap. I saw the aftermath. And I did nothing. His voice didn't shake, but his face held grief. I told myself it wasn't my place, that someone else would intervene. I looked at the other passengers. They looked back at me, and no one moved. He paused. I've thought about that moment every day since. He looked at Cameron. I'm sorry. Cameron stood. He didn't walk to the mic. He walked to Jorge, and he extended his hand. The room held its breath. Jorge took it, and something invisible shifted. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition, the kind that heals cracks beneath the surface. When Cameron returned to his seat, more voices rose. A woman who had lost her brother in an altercation with security at an airport. A flight attendant who confessed she had once filed a complaint about Bradley Hinton and was quietly moved to a different route instead. A corporate trainer who had quit after being told to soften his modules about racial bias. Story after story filled the room. None were dramatic. They were honest. And in their honesty, they were revolutionary. The rebellion wasn't loud. It was steady, one voice at a time. When the final speaker stepped down, Eleanor returned to the front. We'll be releasing tonight's transcripts with consent. Every voice matters. Every echo deserves room. The room stood, not in ovation, but in unity. As people slowly filed out, many stopped to speak with one another. Some exchanged numbers. Others just shared looks that said more than words. Cameron stayed until the last person left. Then he sat alone for a while. The room was quiet now, but not empty. It held something new. Momentum. Later that night, back at the hotel, Elena joined him in the suite's small sitting area. She brought tea. No business talk. No headlines. Just stillness. You did good, she said gently. Cameron looked out at the city lights. No. He said, they did. He opened his notebook and flipped through pages of scribbles. Do you know what I kept thinking tonight? What that it never starts with policy? It starts with a moment, and then someone says, me too. Then someone else says, enough. And before you know it, silence becomes sound. Elena nodded, and sound becomes change. He looked at her. I want to take this further. Not just airlines, schools, hospitals, tech boards, every place where someone still walks in and wonders, will I be treated like I belong? She leaned forward. Then we'll go further. They clinked teacups like a quiet toast. In the distance, snow began to fall. It fell softly, but it did not melt on impact. It stayed, just like the words they had heard tonight. Ether Airlines tried to hold the line. Their official social channels remained quiet, releasing only brief, carefully worded updates. Internal memos were sent to staff urging professionalism during a time of scrutiny. Public relations firms were hired. A crisis management team was brought in. But the wave had already crested, and it was not slowing down. By the end of the week, over 200,000 people had signed a petition calling for Bradley Hinton's permanent dismissal and a federal inquiry into discriminatory behavior in airline service protocols. News outlets began releasing interviews with former passengers who had complaints none as violent as Cameron's experience, but consistent in tone. The pattern had become undeniable. Meanwhile, Cameron Wells was no longer simply a symbol. He had become a movement's voice. His speech at the Geneva summit was republished in the Atlantic, reprinted in law journals, and dissected in classrooms across the country. One quote stood out above the rest. "Dignity is not a courtesy. It is a right, one that should never depend on your seat number, your skin color, or how much noise you make when you're wronged." Protesters began gathering at airports in New York, Atlanta, London, and Los Angeles. They held signs that read, "I could be Cameron, stillness is resistance, and who's next in seat 2? Cameron didn't call for these protests, but he didn't stop them either. He understood something now, something that had taken years to form in him. Moments do not start movements. People do, and people were ready. Inside Aon Link's headquarters, Helena walked into his office carrying a red folder. Her pace was brisk, but her expression was calm. "You should see this," she said, setting the folder on the desk. Cameron opened it and scanned the first few pages. It was a report, a confidential one, conducted by a watchdog group Cameron had quietly funded 2 years ago. It detailed decades of suppressed complaints, non-disclosure agreements, and internal suppression across major U.S. airlines. They've been collecting data on employee misconduct buried under HR filings. Elena explained, names redacted, stories silenced. But it's all here, and most of it's public record. Cameron's jaw tightened. "Send this to the Department of Transportation. It's already on its way," she replied. "Also, the town hall footage went viral overnight. Over 6 million views." Cameron looked up. 6 million, everyone's sharing it, especially the girl in the hoodie. Her words were quoted in Time this morning. He leaned back in his chair, taking it in. "I wonder if she knows what she started." "She will soon," Elena said. "She's been invited to speak at a youth conference next month. They're calling her a voice of the generation." Cameron smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "She just told the truth. That's all she did." "Exactly," Elena said. "And now the truth is louder than the silence ever was." At that moment, Cameron's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered. A familiar voice greeted him. "Mr. Wells, this is Judge Marcy Lowell. I was asked to reach out to you personally." Cameron sat up straighter. Judge Lowell was a federal circuit court judge, widely respected for her rulings on civil liberties. She had rarely made direct calls like this. "I'm currently heading a task force on transportation equity," she said. "We're revising compliance standards, and your testimony, your voice, would be invaluable." Cameron's throat tightened slightly. He had always advocated for policy change behind the scenes. He had helped fund studies, supported reformers, mentored the next generation. But this would be something else. This would be his voice, under oath, shaping law. "I'll be there," he said quietly. Judge Lowell paused. "Thank you. This matters more than you know." That night, Cameron took a walk alone through the city. The air was brisk. The streets hummed with life. People passed by, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to show they recognized him. He liked that. It gave him room to feel. He stopped at a small bookstore near the corner of 14th and Elm In the display window was a stack of books, and among them, a new hardcover with his face on the cover. It was a biography, unauthorized. He stared at it for a long moment. He wondered what version of him it told, the one who had endured, or the one who had endured in silence. The bell above the door jingled. An older man stepped out and noticed him. "Mr. Wells," the man said softly. Cameron turned. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man continued. "I used to work the baggage line. I saw things too. You reminded me that dignity doesn't expire just because no one applauded it." Cameron didn't speak. He simply nodded. And they stood there, two men on a quiet street, carrying stories the world had ignored for too long. When Cameron returned to his hotel, Eleanor was waiting. "There's something else," she said. She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten. It read, "Dear Mr. Wells, I'm the mother of the flight attendant who struck you. I don't know if you'll read this, but I needed to say something. My son was not raised to treat anyone that way. I'm not writing to excuse him. I'm writing because after seeing what you've done, how you responded, I finally see what real strength looks like. I'm sorry for what happened, and I thank you for what you've made possible. Sincerely, Irene Hinton." Cameron held the letter in his hands for a long time. He had not expected that, and yet it didn't surprise him. Hurt was generational. So was healing. The next morning, Cameron stood before a panel of federal officials in Washington, D.C. The cameras were present. The microphones were hot. He wore no armor, no pretense, just a navy blue suit and a quiet resolve. He looked into the eyes of the men and women before him. And he spoke. 10 minutes changed my flight. He began. But centuries shaped the conditions that made that moment possible. He told them everything. Not just about the slap, but about the lifetime of moments that led up to it. The assumptions, the glances, the barriers invisible to those who didn't carry them. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want reform. Real, enforceable reform." He offered policy recommendations, mandatory bias training, not just for flight attendants, but for executives, independent incident review boards, anonymous complaint pathways that couldn't be buried by PR departments, and above all, public accountability. The room fell silent when he finished. Not out of discomfort, out of respect. When he stepped out of the building, a small crowd waited on the steps. Not protesters, not journalists, just people. One woman in a wheelchair held a sign that said, "My seat matters too." A man beside her held another, "Dignity flies with us." Cameron looked at them. He didn't wave. He nodded and kept walking. Because the story wasn't ending here. It was only tipping forward. It started in airports. At first, a few terminals installed plaques with the words "Dignity flies here," along with a QR code linking to training resources on bias, empathy, and equity in travel. Then more followed. Ether Airlines, after a turbulent 2 weeks of internal review, announced the termination of Bradley Hinton and introduced a new passenger equity task force. They didn't frame it as damage control, at least not publicly. They called it a reset, one long overdue. But the real change did not come from policy memos or PR strategies. It came in quieter forms, in classrooms, where students discussed not only what happened to Cameron Wells, but how he responded. In coffee shops, where strangers debated the meaning of strength and silence. In churches, where sermons were rewritten with words like grace under fire and justice with composure. Cameron watched it unfold, not from a podium, but from his kitchen table. He had returned home to New York, not to retreat, but to remember. His brownstone felt different now, as if the walls had been holding their breath for weeks and were finally able to exhale. Stacks of letters lined his dining room. Elena had sorted them by themes: gratitude, grief, confession, hope. One envelope stood out. It was from a boy named Miles, aged 11. His handwriting was crooked, but his message clear. Dear Mr. Wells, I saw what they did to you. My mom told me to look at how you sat still. She said it was like a superhero power. I didn't know people could fight without fists. I want to be like you when I grow up. Love. Miles Cameron set the letter down gently and rubbed the corner of his eye. He was not a superhero. He had simply sat in a seat he paid for. He had asked for a meal he was promised. And he had absorbed a moment meant to reduce him without letting it define him. Later that day, he visited his father's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the wind sharp but bearable. He stood alone, hands in coat pockets, and spoke aloud like he had done since he was a boy. I get it now, he said quietly. He crouched down beside the headstone and traced the carved letters. You always told me, don't fight the fire with fire. Just hold your ground and let the smoke reveal who lit the match. He smiled faintly. I didn't think it would happen like this, but it did. He stayed there for a while. The next day, he received a call from the Smithsonian. They wanted the suit he wore on the flight, the one from seat 2A. They said it represented something greater now, a turning point, a cultural shift, a reminder that strength is not always loud. Cameron hesitated. It was just a suit, fabric and stitching, but maybe, like the seat itself, it had become a symbol. He agreed, and when the exhibit opened months later, it was titled The Power of Stillness. Visitors lined up to see the chair replica and suit behind glass. Some left in tears, others in reflection, but nearly all left changed. Meanwhile, Elena had taken the lead on expanding the Altitude Project. What had started as a town hall had become a full-scale initiative: workshops, mobile apps, employee training tools, youth storytelling scholarships. Cameron remained involved, though always slightly in the background. He had never wanted fame. He wanted impact, and that, finally, was happening. One day, he visited a high school in Chicago, not as a keynote speaker, but as a listener. A teacher had invited him after her students had written essays titled My Version of Seat 2A. A young girl stood in the front of the class. Her voice didn't tremble. In my seat 2A, I was told I couldn't take honors math. But I stayed. I asked questions. I made space. And now I tutor others. A boy stood next in my seat 2A. I had to hide who I was. But seeing you on TV made me think maybe quiet people can still be loud inside. The students clapped. Cameron did not speak. Instead, he wrote them each a letter later that night. No platitudes, just encouragement. He told them their stillness was sacred. Their dignity was inherited, not earned. Their resistance didn't have to come wrapped in rage to be real. The media had begun calling the incident the turning point in row 1. They missed the truth. The turning point didn't begin on that plane. It began long before. In every boardroom Cameron had walked into and been underestimated. In every polite insult he had endured while being called impressive for simply showing up. In every silent scream he had swallowed to preserve the peace. That seat, that slap, had merely peeled back a curtain, and behind it, the country saw itself. Not the version in ads, but the one still learning how to sit beside discomfort without justifying it. Back home, as the evening sun poured in through the windows, Cameron watched his son Mason scribble in a sketch pad. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Mason looked up with a grin. "You." Cameron walked over. The drawing was simple. A man sitting in an airplane seat, eyes looking out the window. Calm, thoughtful, no cape, no lightning, just stillness. "You made me look peaceful," Cameron said. Mason nodded. "You were. For the first time in weeks." Cameron allowed himself a long, quiet breath. It wasn't over. There were still hearings to attend, communities to rebuild, apologies that may never come. But something deeper had changed. Not the world, not yet, but the way people moved in it. The way they held space for others, the way they listened, and most of all, the way they chose to remain whole, even when the world tried to fracture them. As night fell, Cameron sat by the window, the skyline glimmering like a promise. Seat 2O was empty now, but its story wasn't. It had become a place where history paused, looked in the mirror, and quietly decided to shift. The plane touched down in Atlanta with a soft bounce. It had been months since Cameron Wells had flown commercial, not because he feared recurrence, but because time had shifted, demands changed. The world had started to ask for his voice in different ways. Courtrooms, universities, advocacy panels. But this flight, this one, he had chosen. Coach seat, no entourage, no press. He walked through the jet bridge with a quiet steadiness, holding only a leather briefcase. The terminal buzzed with the familiar sounds of luggage wheels, boarding calls, and coffee orders. He was invisible here again, and he welcomed it. Not everything needed an audience. At the arrivals gate, a mural covered the far wall. Colorful, bold, it showed a row of airplane seats. In one, a black man gazed out the window, serene and tall in spirit. Around him were everyday people, children, elders, workers, all holding pieces of light. Above the scene were 5 words: "Stillness can shake the sky." Cameron stopped for a long time. No name on the mural, no explanation. But everyone knew. Behind him, a young woman slowed down, looked at the art, then at him. "You're him," she said softly. Cameron met her eyes. "I'm one of many." She smiled, then walked on, outside. Elna waited in a town car. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Welcome home." "Again?" she said. He smiled. "It's good to breathe familiar air." She handed him a small envelope. "You'll want to read this before tomorrow." Cameron unfolded the paper. It was printed on official stationery from the Department of Transportation. Effective immediately. Ether Airlines will adopt the altitude protocol as national standard for equitable service in aviation. He read it twice. Elna spoke softly. It passed unanimously. He leaned back in the seat. It wasn't a finish line, but it was a milestone. Tomorrow, he'd stand beside lawmakers to help announce the changes. He'd speak not as a victim, but as a contributor to a system now redefined by its own reckoning. But for now, he allowed the silence to settle around him like warm cloth. That evening, Cameron visited the Altitude Youth Program in Atlanta. It had grown quickly, spanning 6 cities. Inside the community center, children from all backgrounds sat cross-legged in a circle, each holding storybooks they'd helped write. A little boy raised his hand. "Are you really the man from the plane?" Cameron chuckled gently. "I was on a plane." "Yes." The boy grinned. "My mom says you made the world safer." "I think we all did," Cameron replied. Another child stood. "What did it feel like?" "When it happened." The room hushed. Cameron paused. "It felt like someone wanted me to shrink." He glanced around the room. "But I didn't. And you won't. Either." The boy nodded as if something clicked into place. Later, as the sun dipped low, Elena joined him in the hallway. "They're going to name the program's new library after you," she said. "I'd rather they name it after someone like Talia Monroe," Cameron replied. "She risked everything to tell the truth. She'll get her honor, too." Elena smiled. "But this one's yours." He didn't argue. Inside, one of the older teens had painted a canvas to hang near the entrance. It showed an empty airplane seat 2A, but in the reflection of the window, a face glowed softly, not with anger or pain, but with clarity. Cameron took a photo of it. He texted it to Mason, adding only, "This is what it looks like when we don't leave." That night, back at his hotel, Cameron finally took time for something he'd put off. He opened the long email thread his legal team had assembled, messages from former flight attendants, airport staff, even retired pilots, all finally coming forward about incidents they'd witnessed or endured. Most ended with some variation of the phrase, "Thank you for not disappearing." Cameron replied to as many as he could, not with legal talk, not with policy, just with his voice. "You were never invisible. We just had to look closer." In the morning, the press conference began with formalities, suits, flags, speeches. But when Cameron approached the podium, the room changed. He adjusted the microphone. "You already know the story," he said. "What matters is what we do with it." He spoke about passengers, but he also spoke about systems. He spoke about humanity as policy, compassion as training, stillness as strength. After the conference, a reporter asked him what seat he'd chosen on the flight to Atlanta. He smiled. 18C, right beside the aisle. No VIT. I didn't need one. That afternoon, Cameron visited a quiet part of town where a small library had requested to host a conversation series inspired by the movement. A circle of chairs awaited him, no cameras, no fanfare, just people. A former ether flight attendant introduced herself. "I left the company," she said. "After what I saw, I didn't want to be part of something that punished stillness and praised silence." Cameron nodded. "What are you doing now I teach?" she said. "Conflict resolution. To kids." He smiled. "That might be the best kind of turbulence training." The room laughed. As the sun began to set, Cameron took a final walk through the city before returning to New York. Passing by a bookstore, he noticed a sign taped to the window. It read, "Reserved for anyone who ever felt like 2A." He stepped inside, bought a copy of a book not about himself, but about collective dignity. On the flight home, he sat in 11A, a window seat. He didn't speak to the attendant, didn't need to. She served him his meal correctly and with care. After clearing the tray, she paused and whispered, "Thank you. For everything." He nodded, then looked out the window. Clouds passed beneath like threads on a quilt. He thought about all the seats that would never look the same again. All the people who now saw stillness not as defeat, but as declaration. He remembered Mason's drawing. He remembered Miles' letter. He remembered Irene Hinton's apology. He remembered the moment it all began. A slap, a silence, and a refusal to let either define the future. As the plane began to descend into New York, the captain's voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Thank you for flying with us." Cameron closed his eyes. The landing didn't feel like the end. It felt like arrival, to leave viewers with reflection, love, and a call to action. Cameron Wells didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike back. But with stillness, he rewrote the rules of resistance. His story reminds us that true strength isn't measured by volume, but by values. that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. And when we choose compassion over chaos, even the smallest seat on a plane can hold the weight of a revolution. To anyone who's ever been told to move, to stay silent, to accept less than they deserve, know this: you are not alone, and you are not invisible. Let's honor the Camerons of the world. Let's hold accountable the voices that dismiss dignity. And let's stand together for a future where no one is judged by where they sit, but by who they are. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice helps these stories fly farther and ensures they're never forgotten. Thank you for watching. And remember, some landings change more than just the flight.